Alrighty, so we'll go ahead and get started. So today we're gonna start talking about how psychologists evaluate law enforcement officers. Ooh, a little bit of like going through puberty there, sorry. But one of the things I wanted to acknowledge, I don't know how many people have had time to be on Twitter or the news this morning, is there was another shooting at a university last night at Michigan State University. And I know it's really hard to hear about those. It can be really scary. And so I was able to go to the training last week and the Run Hide Fight training for active shooters. And it's something that really made me think. And this video, I like assigned it for extra credit, but I think it's really valuable and really related to our class material. And so it depicts an active shooter situation, but you don't actually see the shooter. But just wanted to give a heads up that, you know, there are gunshots and that can be traumatic to some people. But just sort of illustrates things that I think I'm thinking about with my classes in general, but are obviously relevant to what we just talked about with school violence here in this class. So I'm going to go ahead and play this. And we can take a couple minutes to talk about it before we dive into our.
Hi, can I get you started with drinks?
Oh, I'm sorry, I gotta take this.
We'll need a minute.
No, I'm here.
Hey, you need to back up. You can't be here anymore. Get out of my face, man. You think I'm afraid of you? Man, get off, man. 911, there's a clip.
Running makes you harder to hit and improves your chances of survival. Don't go up here.
Police, where is he?
By the bar, blue jeans, black shirt. Empty hands up, follow their instructions.
I'm in the direct line of fire if I head for either exit, but I have other options to help me survive. Guys, come on, in here. Come on. Go, go, go. Lock and barricade the door.
Both my exits are blocked by the shooter. I gotta stay hidden. I'm no victim. I'm ready for this.
He's applying direct pressure to the wound to stop the bleeding until we can find a tourniquet. In the meantime, turn off your phones and make a plan to defend yourself.
We have to fight to survive. If you control the weapon, you control the shooter. I'll go for the gun. He'll go for his arms. The bartender will go for the head.
Where is he?
We got him right here. Stand
Please,
down.
show me your hand.
Over here.
You can survive a mass shooting if you're prepared. Remember, run, hide, or fight. Run. Wherever you go, be aware of alternate exits. Quickly and cautiously evacuate in a direction away from the attacker. Don't hesitate. Seconds matter. Remember windows and emergency exits. Leave belongings behind. Keep your empty hands raised and clearly visible when exiting a building. Follow all instructions from the police. Don't stop until you're sure you've reached a safe location. Hide. If there is no safe escape route, find a good hiding place. Lock and barricade the door. Silence cell phones. Prepare a defense plan. Fight. Fight only as a last resort. Use available objects as improvised weapons. Use teamwork and surprise. A coordinated ambush can incapacitate an attacker. You're fighting for your life. Don't fight fair. Stop the bleed. A victim can die of uncontrolled blood loss in 5 minutes or less. Apply pressure or a tourniquet to control severe bleeding. Go to fbi.gov/survive to learn more.
So again, the person who was here last week was from the FBI. And so he talked about these, and one of the things I really appreciated is he talked about some of the issues with some of our rooms. How many of you have had classes or have classes this semester in Clark? Okay, couple. What's the major issue with the classrooms on the second floor in Clark? Anyone think of it? Well, the temperature in general, but in terms of like an active shooter, the doors open outward, right? And so he gave tips for like, you can pull it and sort of hide underneath it. This, we're lucky this swings in, we could just put tables in front of it. He said cinder blocks or bricks are good, so obviously there's only one door out of the room, but we can go 2 directions out. And then he said windows, right? Another option. The way that a lot of folks survived the Virginia Tech shooting was actually going out 2nd-story windows. And like they may have broken legs, but they're still here, right? And again, I'm not trying to like traumatize you. It's just this training really impressed on me that like the most important thing is to think about what you do before it happens, because if you wait, and that's where you're costing yourself precious seconds. So like one of the things he talked about is like, don't rationalize it. Don't be like, oh, someone just setting off fireworks in the middle of the day, right outside Village 2, right? Like, so just reacting. And so it's just something to be thinking about. Unfortunately, again, it's a reality. He showed us the statistics and how much the numbers have gone up. They've only been tracking them for about 20 years, but the numbers of active shooter incidents have, surprisingly to one, increased dramatically, right? And so, and this is anywhere you are, right? He said he used to, he has 2 now adult children, and he used to, when they were in a restaurant, be like, okay, if something happened, where'd you go? Where would you go? And they like point out the exits to him. It's really sad that we have to think that way, right? But I also really care about y'all. I want y'all to live. And so that was my biggest concern, is always like, I'm gonna want to protect you all. And so him like reminding me we could go out the windows, right, made me feel a lot better. And thinking about different things we can do. So like getting low, usually the shooter's gonna shoot sort of high. And also if they find the door blocked, they're typically gonna go on to another door. So I don't know the likelihood we would ever have something here, but it's just sort of good to be prepared. So what are people's thoughts, reactions to thinking about this? And I know it's, again, fully acknowledging it's scary, right? And it's okay if you need more time to process. It's all right. We can move on to our lecture for today, but just again, something to think about, something to be aware of to protect yourselves. And I, again, am always going to be trying to protect y'all. We can also drop these blinds if we need to, do things like that. The last thing I would recommend is install the LiveSafe app on your phone if you haven't already, because if something happens on campus, they'll let us know that way. All right, so today what we're going to talk about is not only what do police officers do, but also how do psychologists get involved in law enforcement. So the police officer's job is divided into 3 areas. So the first is enforcing the law. And so this is making arrests. The second is maintaining order, things like keeping traffic moving if there's an accident, something along those lines. And then the third is providing services like helping stranded motorists, things along those lines. So looking at those 3, which would you say, just based on what you think about police officers and their duties, would you say they spend most of their time doing? Who thinks it's enforcing the law? You just raise your hand. Okay, who thinks it's maintaining order? All right, who thinks it's providing services? All right, y'all are spot on. Yeah, this is the majority of their police activity is actually providing services. Enforcing the law accounts for only 10% of police activity, which is why it's even more horrific that so much of that lately has resulted in the death of innocent people, right? And then maintaining order, things like keeping traffic moving, accounts for about 30% of the police activity. If you guys another example of what that might be. So until we had a light out here, so when I first got to Wesleyan, we didn't have a light at the head of campus. Like either the police or our security guards would have to go out and direct traffic. And like the city, Wesleyan was petitioning to get a light there, and the city's like, you don't need one. And then like one of our security guards who was doing that got hit by a car, and they were like, oh, maybe you need a light. So you know, things like that, helping out at major events, things along those lines. But yeah, providing services is the most of what they do. Whether or not they do that well, again, it's going to depend on that particular person, unfortunately. All right, so psychologists have been involved in selection of law enforcement officers for quite some time. It actually began back in 1916 when a psychologist whose last name was Terman tested 30 applicants for police and firefighter jobs. So we'll also evaluate like folks for fire departments as well. And he was looking at IQ in particular, and he found that the average IQ among these applicants was 84 and recommended that no one with an IQ below 80 should be accepted for those jobs. So just a little context about the IQ score. IQ is intelligence quotient, and it is a standardized test, and the average is always 100, and then the standard deviation is 15 in either direction. So 80 is 2 standard deviations below the mean. And that's why we often choose that. Now we look way beyond just IQ. In the 1960s and 70s, several national commissions, including the 1967 President's Commission on Law Enforcement, recommended formal psychological evaluation and assessment of police personnel in all departments. And by the 1990s, formal assessment of candidates for police academy basically had become routine. And psychological evaluation is not going to identify like your ideal candidates. That's not really what we're tasked with looking at. It can be used to screen out those with specific problems that would interfere with their effective functioning as police officers. So how do you get involved for this? Maybe not surprisingly, you have to be a licensed psychologist with a PhD or a PsyD typically. The APA has standards for providers of psychological services. Practitioners should meet the minimal qualifications for a professional psychologist. If the state requires a license for providers of psychological services, they should be licensed as psychologists in their states and be in good standing. That's literally every state, so I don't know why they say is. You have to be licensed to practice psychology in the applied sense. This person needs to be thoroughly trained in assessment procedures. So not just like they read it themselves, but like they took assessment classes that had supervised assessment training. They can offer evidence of their adequate training or experience in the area of psychological test interpretation and psychological assessment techniques. Typically, this can be shown by something like a transcript, right? Showing that you took courses and practica in this. They know the research literature related specifically to psychological screening for police, right? You should know what the most common tests given are, what the research is saying about what works, what doesn't. You should be up to date, basically. They need a working knowledge of several different things, as you can see here. So first is the Uniform Guidelines of Employee Selection Procedures. Along that line, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and associated fair employment issues. So you need to make sure that you, as the assessing psychologist, are not being discriminatory in your practice, right? So you don't want to exclude someone just because they show signs of depression, right? Like that's not gonna necessarily make someone incapable as a police officer. You need working knowledge of the regulations issued by the EEOC, which is the Equal Employment Office, something. I'm blanking on it. But regarding psychological and mental disabilities, again, you don't want to discriminate based on those. You need a working knowledge of pertinent APA guidelines covering psychological testing. So for example, there is a whole division of the APA, which we talked about previously, Division 18, that looks at psychology in the law, and they have recommended guidelines for pre-employment screening for law enforcement officers. So you would need to be familiar with those. You also need firsthand knowledge from talking to folks, maybe doing ride-alongs, things like that, of the peace officer's job, the law enforcement official's job as it's performed within that agency. You also need to understand the job-related criteria the agency is interested in measuring, and how those criteria relate to the actual procedure, right? So if they want to know, I want to make sure this person doesn't have antisocial personality disorder, right? We don't want to give that person a gun and a badge, right? You need to figure out, how am I assessing that? You also are willing to testify in court to the validity of the psychological screening process. So it is possible that you reject someone, you say, no, this person shouldn't be a law enforcement officer, and they sue and say, this is my lifelong dream, how dare you, right? So you need to be able to testify in court as to why what you did showed that this person would not be a good candidate. And so you need to have a working knowledge of the laws surrounding screening, not only federal, but also at the state level, an understanding of the tests as they relate to employment selection, and data supporting the validity of the screening process that's conducted by the agency. So again, this is where familiarity with the literature becomes really important. You also need to have a good relationship with folks throughout the agency, including the training officers and the top level administrators, so they'll back you up, right? You want to conduct frequent debriefing sessions with administrators and any other psychologists on staff. You want to conduct in-house education programs with all staff members so they will understand the limits of psychological screening. So they know, like, I can't read this person, this isn't the Minority Report, right? I can't determine whether this person will commit a crime. But here's what I'm able to predict. And you're responsible for anyone you're supervising. So if you have a trainee working with you to conduct these, you are responsible for any mistakes they make as their supervisor. This is something that I did not even realize until I talked to my advisor after I graduated from grad school. But when we practiced as student clinicians, we were actually practicing under our supervisor's license. So like if anything went wrong, it put their license in jeopardy technically. So yeah, you want to be really careful, and our supervisors were. All right, I didn't make the handout, so that's not helpful. I think I have it posted here though, so let me take a quick look. And I can pull it up. Pretty sure I have it on Blackboard. Yep, here we go. Perfect. I'll just bring it up and let me do a new share so that folks on Zoom will be able to see it as well. And so yeah, this is posted if you want to print it for yourselves, or you can just look at it online on Blackboard. But I'll go ahead and zoom in so that y'all can see it. All right, so these are the guidelines adopted by the Police Psychological Services section in 1998 and still in force today. So this is like guidelines for a prospective police officer comes to your office as a psychologist. You're going to assess them to see whether they're psychologically fit to become a police officer. So these are guidelines, right? And so they should only be one part of the selection process. And in fact, in a lot of municipalities, the law states you can't use like psychological evals to select someone for employment or not. So what they do is they'll contingently hire those folks and then put them through the process because that's legal for whatever reason. So you might be seeing someone who's like contingently hired depending upon your state, your locality. So they should be doing an interview, probably a fitness test, right? A whole host of other things. There might be a written test, things along those lines. It should not only be your eval, because you're typically not a police officer, right? You don't know what they need very specifically for this particular person. And you need to be familiar with the research literature, not only on like what techniques you should be using, but also how to interpret them in this particular scenario. And you should be licensed and trained in this particular type of assessment. And data on attributes considered most important for effective performance should be obtained from job analysis, their interview, their surveys, other important sources. So typically as part of your evaluation, you would be able to see that other information as well. You're going to provide the agency administrators with information regarding the benefits and limits. So what we talked about in terms of educating them. So that they know you're not, again, a magic mind reading wizard, right? Like, here's what you'll be able to tell them, but here's what you won't be able to tell them. And then you should make provisions for the security of test materials. So you shouldn't like send someone home with a test book. One of your jobs ethically as a psychologist, regardless of whatever field you're in and whatever context you're doing assessments, is to safeguard those materials so that, let's say I'm giving someone a personality inventory and I send them home with it. They've got a whole bunch of buddies who are also applying for the academy. Right now they make photocopies and pass it out and they try to figure out the test together, right? We don't want people doing that. We want these tests to be accurate representations of this person's psychological functioning. And then also security of access to and retention of psychological report, and particularly the raw data. There are going to be people, regardless of the type of assessment you're doing, who are going to be like, you have to give me everything. I need to see the raw scores. And it's your job as a psychologist to be like, no, here's what you need. You need my reports giving you my conclusions. You also need to have them sign an informed consent so that they know they're not your client. The law enforcement agency that hired you is, right? And nothing they tell you is confidential, that it's all going to go in the report. So again, we should be choosing instruments that are objective, that are job related, that actually have some research behind them, they're validated. You know, having those test results before the screening interviews can be helpful. Any test you have them do should be validated for use with this particular sample, right? You shouldn't just pick up a random test that's never been used for a job eval before and use it. Again, not only do you want to like be fair and ethical in how you evaluate these people, but you need to be able to stand up in court if they suit you, right? And say, yes, there's lots of research showing this. If you're doing any kind of like computerized test scoring, you should verify and interpret the individual results, make sure that there were no errors, because that can happen. And then again, making sure you're following ADA guidelines. And making sure that you're not being discriminatory. So, this is something, no matter, again, what area of psychology you're practicing, you should do an interview with the person, right? And this is so you can get stuff in their own words. You can find out, how they explain things. If you don't do this and you just do paper and pencil type things, you're missing out on a lot of good information, nonverbals, right? The way that they, sort of engage with you as an authority figure, things along those lines. And so they recommend a semi-structured job-related interview. These are things that already exist. You would just, use one that's been well validated for this particular type of evaluation. And then you want to make sure you give yourself enough time to do the interview. A 20-minute interview is probably not going to be sufficient. You want to make sure you have plenty of time. So you provide a written report to the person who's going to be doing the hiring or not. And so that you're going to evaluate the suitability of the candidate for the position based on the analysis of everything you looked at. Reports to the agency should contain some sort of rating and or recommendation. Usually the agency will tell you what they prefer for employment, justification for why you recommend this person be hired or not. And then any reservations that you have regarding the results themselves. So while they were taking, this particular personality test, the fire alarm went off, and that probably threw off their concentration, and so that needs to be taken into account. And then diagnosis isn't going to help. For one, the folks who are making the job hiring decision, that often won't make any sense to them. They won't know what you mean by this person has antisocial personality disorder, right? For the other, that's not your goal in this assessment, right? Your goal is not to come up with some sort of psychological diagnosis. Your goal is to determine whether or not this person should be considered as a candidate. So the screening should focus on the candidate's ability to perform the essential functions of that position. You try not to just use like cutoff scores, like if they're above this, they get hired, if they're below this, they don't. Because again, you're trying to take into account the interview, all of the assessment materials you're engaging with, again, any notes from the evaluators, things along those lines. But if you have to use them, you need to acknowledge that and talk about that. And again, it shouldn't be based on one source. You should be looking at all of everything. And then you want to make clear disclaimers in your reports so that this is only valid for a certain amount of time, right? If I assess someone today and then they're not going to hire them for a year, they need to be reevaluated. A lot can happen in a year. People can be involved in traumatic incidents. Person can have a traumatic brain injury, right? Lots of different things. So you need to make it clear that like this is not valid forever, right? This person might change. And so then in terms of follow-up, they shouldn't be used for purposes other than making this decision, right? So sometimes people will be like, well, when you first came here, X, Y, and Z happened. So that means that's inappropriate. That shouldn't be used that way. These are being used for a very specific position. You can do research if you de-identify the data. So you could use like all the data of everyone who applied and was assessed to look at things. But they shouldn't be used for any subsequent disciplinary or like if the person is involved in a crime themselves matters. And it's really important to keep collaborating with that law enforcement agency so that you all can like come up with consistent ways that you agree on evaluating these folks. And then each agency should look and be like, are we seeing any discriminatory things? Are people with certain disabilities being excluded? Are people of certain races being excluded, or genders? If you're finding that, you need to probably find a different psychologist to do the evaluation. And again, as I mentioned, you should be prepared to defend your process and findings. And you may need to do that in court, depending. So this is something that in general, being a psychologist in this area entails. So that if you're doing something within the legal process at any point in time, you just need to assume that at some point, someone could ask you about it in court. So anything you write, anything you talk about, you need to be very precise in your language, need to be very careful in how you explain things. You can assume that any sentence of a report used for these purposes could be questioned in court. So solid writing also becomes extremely important when you are a psychologist, particularly working in this area. So as we just covered in those guidelines, psychologists who evaluate police candidates rely on those interviews, observations of candidates in situations that reflect real world physical work. These are sometimes called situational tests, and then psychological tests. So we're going to start by talking about the interview. So interviews are widely used, like I said, in any context that you as a psychologist would be assessing someone, despite evidence suggesting that interviews are subject to distortion, potentially low reliability, and questionable validity. These are really useful for orientating candidates to the evaluation more than for predicting their subsequent performance. Reliability does seem to be increased by the use of structured interviews, as I mentioned in those guidelines, those in which the wording, order, and content of the questions in the interview are standardized. You essentially follow a script. So, in this case, you would be asking them about very specific things related to the position. Unstructured interviews, you're much more likely to use in a clinical setting where someone's coming to you for treatment. And these are really open-ended questions that you can ask in any order, like, tell me what brought you in today. Or tell me about your previous history. It's a good way to gather a lot of information from the client. One of the most common structured interviews used in a clinical setting is the structured clinical interview for the DSM or SCID. This is used to determine diagnoses because the questions match the symptoms. You would not use this in a police pre-employment evaluation because, as we talked about, diagnosis isn't important, right? You're really trying to answer, would this person, is there really more than anything else you're trying to answer, is there anything psychological that disqualifies this person from doing this job? You might also include what's called a mental status exam, which is a set of questions and observations that systematically evaluate awareness, orientation, attention, memory, judgment, thought content, mood, and you even look at things like appearance. And this is not in like a judgy way, like, oh, I can't believe they're wearing that, right? This is like, are they engaging in basic grooming, right? Does it seem like they took a shower today? Things along those lines, because those can be an indicator of underlying mental issues like severe depression. All right, so the situational tests use tests similar to those done by officers on the job. They are designed to predict performance in the academy and on the job, and one of the examples is the Foot Patrol observation test. There's evidence that such ability tests are somewhat better predictors of job performance than other measures, and this is really not surprising because in psychology, we know that the best predictor of future behavior is current or past behavior. However, they are time-consuming and expensive. So for that reason, a lot of police departments don't use them. which you can kind of think of as problematic, right? Now, in terms of psychological tests, there are a lot of good standardized psychological tests that have good, what we call psychometrics. They're reliable, they're valid, we can be pretty confident in the answers we get from them. And there are two types of tests that are included in most police selection batteries. The first is tests of cognitive or intellectual ability. And this would be something like an IQ test. And the second, which we'll talk more about, are tests of personality traits, emotional stability, and even something like integrity. Intelligence scores are only weakly related to actual police performance in the field, but these personality tests do have better predictive abilities. So the InVault personality test was designed specifically to identify psychologically unsuitable law enforcement candidates. So it was developed for this purpose. And so it is 310 items, but you just rate them true, false. So you can actually finish this much more quickly than you would imagine. And it was empirically derived in law enforcement settings. It was developed, as I mentioned, specifically for these types of assessment. There are 26 behavioral scales related to law enforcement functioning. The whole list is here, but just to give you all some of the examples: guardedness. There are scales about alcohol and drugs, difficulties in previous jobs, trouble with law and society, hyperactivity, anxiety, being the loner type. In police settings, you're supposed to work collaboratively with other folks, so that could be an issue. Lack of assertiveness, interpersonal difficulties, suspiciousness, family conflicts, things along those lines. And then there's also an empirically derived risk rating. So this will give you not a cutoff, but a rating of how risky it would be to hire this person as a police officer. And InVault himself, who came up with this test, developed that risk rating procedure. We might also use tests that are not specifically constructed for this type of assessment, but instead are used widely across various types of psychological assessments, and therefore have a lot of good research behind them. And one of the common ones that is used is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, or MMPI. So the original had 567 items. Realizing I don't have the 3 on here, which came out last year. But the 3 is only like 300 some items. So they've cut it down drastically. And an individual responds true, false, or they can leave it blank, and that's classified as they cannot say. Some example items are: I'd rather win than lose in a game. I'm never happier than when I'm alone. My hardest battles are with myself. So the clinical scales assess symptoms of disorders like depression, but also some personality traits. And then the validity scales assess careless responding and lying. So there are different validity scales that measure things like, did you just go through and answer true to everything? Are you paying attention? Like, there's essentially the same item in the beginning and the end of the test, and did you answer it the same way? There are validity scales that are fake good scales. So like, are you trying to present yourself as better than really anybody is? Like, one of my favorite items on this is I read the newspaper cover to cover every day. Like, nobody actually does that. No one's reading every classified ad and all of that, right? But there's also a fake bad scale that's more useful in clinical settings where someone could be like crying out for help by exaggerating their symptoms. So there's also other scales as well that get at more nuanced issues. The MMPI was derived using a really interesting method called empirical keying. And so in order to do this, psychologists gather a lot of items They come up with them themselves, they ask experts in the field, they'll pull from previous personality tests. So now a lot of people will actually take items from the MMPI when they do this for a new type of test. And then they'll administer items to people already divided into two groups. So for the MMPI, they wanted a schizophrenia scale. So they took people who were inpatient hospitalized for schizophrenia and gave it to them, and then gave them to a group of people who were not inpatient hospitalized for schizophrenia. And they compared people's answers and basically the items that the folks with schizophrenia endorsed, but the other folks did not, became the items on that scale. And then you compare the answers of different groups. And test makers do not care what the content of the items is. Some will not even look. In fact, one of the original authors of the MMPI would boast that he had never read all the items because he didn't care. He just cared about the results it gave them. Then you do cross-validation, where you give it to new samples of people who you know are diagnosed with schizophrenia or not, and see if it can differentiate between them. If it succeeds, that's great. You're ready to use it. If not, it's repeated and rehoned. There were a lot of problems, however, with the original sample of the MMPI. So as you can see, the M here stands for Minnesota. They only collected data in Minnesota. And this was in like the 1940s. So the sample was largely white, largely rural, very much Scandinavian in ancestry, which is great for measuring those folks, but not for applying it to anyone outside that population, right? And then they also, their control groups were often the families of the folks who were in the hospital. What could be a potential difficulty with that if we say this is a control group, people who don't have schizophrenia? What do we know about schizophrenia and depression and bipolar disorder in terms of families? Yeah, exactly. It's genetic. There's our genetic components. So even if someone might not have met full criteria, they might have shown traits of schizophrenia, which makes it less clean. So in 1989, they did the first major revision. It took a while. And they found a much better, much more representative sample from all over the country. They originally called this the MMPI Restandardization Project. They introduced new items and they removed items that were offensive. Some of the language used in the 1940s, as you can imagine, not so great in the 1980s or today. And also there were items on there that were illegal for job screening purposes. And this is not the only type of job screening that the MMPI is used for. So they took those off. And the MMPI 2 restructured format, or RF, was published in 1989. 2008. And this was built off redoing the clinical scales. So when they analyzed those clinical scales that got at schizophrenia, depression, anxiety, what they found is because of the empirical keying, a lot of those scales actually had items in common. And what they realized when they looked at these items is that these just represented being upset, demoralized, part of having a mental illness. So they pulled those items out and they made them their own subscale called demoralization. And then they had cleaner subscales of those symptoms of the disorders. It's also shorter. And they made sure there were no overlapping items at each level of interpretation. They based it on research data, but they didn't empirically rekey it. They used a statistical method called factor analysis instead. And then, as I mentioned, the MMPI 3 came out last year. It's pretty similar to the 2. They've just added a couple things. So for example, the MMPI has never had a scale measuring disordered eating behavior. It has one now. That's really nice for eating disorder researchers and clinicians. Things along those lines. Just real quick before I go on, one of the reasons I know so much about the MMPI is that where I got my PhD, Kent State University has very strong ties. So Jack Graham, who actually just passed away about a month or two ago, which is really sad. He was just like the nicest guy. You would never have known just interacting one-on-one that he was this huge name in the field. And then Yossi Ben Horath, who is the first author in both the MMPI 2RF and the MMPI 3, were both faculty at Kent State. And so I learned about it from them, and they supervised my reports. And it was really cool because we were I think we were the first, we were kind of Yossi's dress rehearsal for his presentation and training about the 2RF when it came out in 2008. And Jack wasn't part of the 2RF revision. And so he was sitting in the audience and asking really nuanced questions about the items. It was just so interesting to see like sort of the old guard of assessment asking the new version of assessment questions. Really, really cool. And Yossi continues to be a leader in this field, doing a lot of research in this area. So in fact, when I did my training on the MMPI 3, it was an 8-hour webinar with Yossi. I was like, oh, that's like being back in grad school. So again, this is why I know a lot. Jack, who I mentioned, has just recently passed away. He's the one who taught me psych and the law as well. All right, so once you get, for some reason I don't have give me a second. I don't have a slide for this, but I have some good information here. So the IPI, the Inwald Personality Inventory, has great reliability, and research suggests that it is really good at predicting who will do well as a police officer. And that's better than that of the MMPI. And that makes sense if we think about it, because the IPI was developed for this purpose, right? So it's going to be much more specific. Research in 1995 had looked at both the MMPI and the IPI related to indicators of performance 1 year later. Things like ranking by a superior, looking into their records for reprimands and compliments. And the IPI scores generated stronger relationships. The IPI correctly classified 72% of officers who had no negative indicators, whereas the MMPI only did 64%. So even though the MMPI has all this great research behind it, in this case, the IPI is probably your better choice. If you're in a setting where you're able to do both, probably even better predictive validity. Now, in general, police screening does seem to be pretty effective. That you have positive relationships between the screening results and actually how well they perform. And we've also gathered peer ratings from trainees, and those correlate with job retention of police officers, but not with other measures of job performance. But we also know that people are going to try to fake good here, because if you're applying to be a police officer, you want to look really good on the evals. So that's just something you need to be aware of as you go through and look at those validity scales. So the person's been hired, everything goes great in their training, they're doing well, and then something happens, right? Maybe they have a physical or intellectual or a mental issue come up. Maybe they've been involved in an officer involved shooting incident. Something traumatic has happened on the job. So as a result of these types of incidents, officers can become psychologically impaired. And police administrators can order an officer to undergo an evaluation that's called a fitness for duty evaluation to continue performing their duties. So oftentimes they're put on like desk work while this type of evaluation is going on. And there's two different models for these fitness for duty evaluations. Some departments will use the same psychologist to evaluate this person for fitness for duty, and then also to provide any therapy that they need. And in other places, the psychologist who evaluates does not provide the treatment. And this can avoid an ethical conflict between keeping therapy confidential and disclosing an officer's psychological functioning to your supervisors. So here again, we can go back to our handout. And again, this is posted on Blackboard for anyone who wants to go back and look at it later. So yeah, as we mentioned, when we said that you have to tell people this is not valid forever, people's psychological state can change, right? You could have the best fitness or best screening eval when you're hired ever, and then something happens to you and you're not as well prepared to be out there in the field. So these are guidelines for conducting these fitness for duty evaluations. So again, you have to be highly specialized training in this particular area. They should be only conducted by qualified person. They need to be licensed. It can be a psychologist or a psychiatrist, but you have to be experienced in diagnosis. So here, diagnosis does matter more because you're going to be looking at this more like a therapy patient, and then also thinking about how that applies to the job. You need training and background in test interpretation, and in particular, doing assessment and interpretation of that assessment in this setting for law enforcement officials. You need familiarity with the research literature and the essential job functions. You need a knowledge of case law and other legal requirements like the ADA. Some of this is sounding familiar. You need to focus your practice on police psychology or be under the supervision of a police psychologist. They want people who really specialize in this. And then be prepared for training and experience to qualify as an expert. For again, people can sue and say, I should be able to go back to work, right? And you might have to go testify. So the client here is not the person in front of you. It is the law enforcement agency. But you must also have a duty of care to that person, because that person, if they're coming to you for a fitness for duty evaluation, they're probably not doing okay, right? So you need to have some sensitivity, some empathy, some care for what's going on for them. And you also need to make that really clear to them. Like, I want to support you and hear you out, but know that anything you say to me cannot be held confidentially because it will have to go into this report. And you avoid conflicts of interest. So, for example, if you've previously had this person as a client, then you definitely shouldn't do their eval because you know a lot more about them post-incident or pre-incident, right, than you should. If this person is like a member of your family, a friend, someone who, you know, you bought your car from and you plan to buy your next car from, someone you've been in a romantic relationship with, someone else should do the eval. You want to, again, not only for the ethical purpose for that person in front of you, but also keeping the public safe, making sure everything's above board. But again, if this has to go to court and they're like, oh, this is your best friend, well, we could throw everything out the window, right? And this person can be reinstated whether or not they're fit for duty. And so you want to be really careful about everything. If, let's say, you're the only police psychologist in a very small rural area, you need to be upfront about that conflict, right? And disclose that and document it. And everyone should say, yeah, this is just the best thing we can do. So this is something really important that can get sort of misconstrued by the law enforcement agency. Sometimes they will treat this as punishment. Oh, you're not doing well, you got to go for a fitness for duty eval, right? That's not helpful, right? This is genuinely to try to see if the person should be out on the street or not. And again, hopefully helping the person in front of you as well as the agency and the general public. So you need to make sure they tell you why this person's being referred. They need to be very clear in their referral document. And then this means that they've got on record, they're kind of covering themselves legally too, right? That there's a reason why they're sending this. You want a written referral, you could put that in your documentation with the report. So they identify the reasons for referral and might detail the agency's attempts, if any, to remediate the problem. So maybe they've given them some training, tailored supervision, disciplinary practices, mentoring, reassignment. EAP is Employee Assistance Program. Many, not only law enforcement agencies, but just companies in general now have access to EAPs either on site or through their insurance. And these are places where, without really using your insurance benefits, you can go for typically something like 3 or 6 sessions for therapy. And then, or they can say, those weren't appropriate in this particular scenario, right? So something is so egregious, we just need them evaluated right now. They came in the station and they were ranting about demons taking over. We're really concerned they had a psychotic break. They clearly shouldn't be holding a weapon on the street right now, right? And so you want to collect as much information as you can. And this will become a theme as we talk about other types of evals throughout the semester. So a lot of what forensic psychologists do is assessment. So when we're evaluating people for fitness for duty, when we're evaluating for them for not guilty by reason of insanity, when we're evaluating child custody, we're always going to be trying to collect as much data as possible to get as much of a clear picture of what's going on as possible. So look at their records, look at performance evals, look at if there was an internal affairs investigation. Here is an appropriate place to look at their pre-employment screening just to see what might have changed, right? Were they in officer involved shootings? Are there civil claims against them, disciplinary actions, medical or treatment records, things along those lines. You need basically you find the information you need to answer the referral question. Is this person fit to be in the field? The person has to know it's happening, right? I mean, hopefully they're going to be a participant. They need to give written consent to say, yes, I understand. This is the reason you're doing this eval. And there's a possibility that you would say, I'm not fit for duty. So they need to be appropriate for the purpose and the scope of the assessment. Again, I'm going to disclose everything you say in the report. So there's no confidentiality between you and I. Who's going to get the report? If the officer declines, that they won't consent to that, then basically you just say, okay, I still have to do it. And you get as much documentation as you can saying why you have to do it. The ideal is that they will consent to the process because they know it's in their favor to cooperate, right? And so then you look at what the referral question is, right? Did this person have a psychotic break? Were they involved in an officer involved shooting? Have they just had a series of things going wrong where it's something sort of like raising a lot of red flags, right? So you need to look at that referral question. And then you use your clinical judgment to determine what am I going to use to assess the particular person. So it's not going to be like the employment ones where there's just like a standard battery you give to everybody. You're going to change what you're asking them and the types of assessment you're using based on what that referral question is. So a multi-method examination, evaluation. So you're going to do an interview, you're going to do questionnaires, you're going to, again, look in their records, things along those lines. And so you're going to select assessment instruments that have a clear understanding of the psychological issues of the case. They're relevant, you're not going to use irrelevant stuff, right? Things along those lines. So you want to review the requested background information. You want to use objective, well-validated tests appropriate to the referral questions. You know, Is this a personality thing? Do we think this person now has a psychological disorder? This person got a head injury and now we think they might have developed some cognitive issues and we're not sure if they can understand what's going on. And other specialized things as well. And then you need enough assessment instruments to actually answer the question that you're being asked in the referral. So again, you need that face-to-face comprehensive clinical interview. You want to include that mental status information. Are they with me? Are they paying attention, right? Can they actually participate in this interview? You want to do a biopsychosocial history. So this might mean you talk to their family members with their consent. You get their educational records. You look at their employment records, their medical records. If there are legal or financial issues coming out, right? If this person has been caught embezzling, you need to look at their financial issues. Their attitudes reflecting bias and prejudice. They're one of these officers that has killed an unarmed Black person. We need to look into that, right? We're probably going to find some bias and prejudice. And that might be insurmountable, right? A history of psychological problems and treatment, right? Is this something that came out of the blue or have they had symptoms in the past? So third-party collateral interviews, so their partner, right? Witnesses who are at whatever happened, things, their supervisor. And then referral to or consultation with a specialist if the presenting problem goes out beyond the expertise. So like I'm trained in neuropsychological assessment. If someone came to me after traumatic brain injury, I could do an assessment to see sort of what types of skills they're impaired on. But in order to actually see where in the brain it's affected, I would need to refer them to a neurologist, right? Who could do that type of work. The agency gets the information they need to answer the referral question. So let's say in the course of your interview, your person discloses to you that they're LGBTQ+. I can't imagine a single thing where that would be relevant, right? They don't need to know that. But if they say, yeah, I killed a guy and I liked it, they need to know that, right? Things along those lines. So you're going to be looking at the presence or absence of job-related personality traits, characteristics, disorders, propensities, or conditions that would interfere with performance of their job. So again, you're going to provide a written report, very carefully written, thinking about any of these sentences could be questioned in court. And it should be restricted to the presence or absence of those functional job-related limitations with pertinent psychological problems linked to the job functions. You don't just say like, this person's depressed. Okay, is that actually going to affect their job functioning or not, right? You need to link it. And then talk about which job functions. So they give the example of an officer has a documented pattern of citizen complaints for rude and discourteous behavior. And we've tried training, counseling, mentoring, it's just not working. And there's yet another serious citizen complaint. The fitness for duty findings include a test and interview of signs of characteristic hostility and lack of interpersonal sensitivity. And this basically says, this person's going to keep doing this. They're not fit for duty. Should have a clear opinion if the officer is presently fit for unrestricted duty, they can go back to their normal job. Fit for duty with optional time limited accommodations. This might be something like working fewer hours or only working in a desk job. Temporarily unfit for duty, and you propose some sort of intervention like going through therapy, things along those lines, or unfit for duty and this person's just not going to get better, right? That's really important. So if they're found fit for duties, examiners should assume that duty will be unrestricted. If they're fit for unrestricted duty, the written report requires little psychological information. You basically need to say they're good, everything's good, awesome. If you can't get the info you need, For the evaluation, you might give caveats in your recommendation that this is based on available data. It could be affected by specific additional information requested, but you couldn't get it. And you might want a disclaimer that indicates that we need to kind of interpret this with caution. If the person is deemed as temporarily unfit for duty, then you need to have like, this is what they need to do in order to be considered fit for duty. So that's going through therapy, a modified job assignment, mentoring, training, other things along those lines. And then you do a re-review or you repeat the assessment process after they've been through that. And intervention recommendations should be consistent with the resources available. So if it's not possible, if this is a police department that has 3 people and they can't have a person just on desk duty, right, you need to like acknowledge that. If the officer is found unfit with a poor prognosis for recovery, or you put them through therapy or these other remediation efforts and they don't work, the opinion should include the evaluator's view that further efforts to correct the condition just won't work. And you need to be clear about why. You are not the person who has to explain this to that officer. The agency can talk to you about giving them feedback, but typically it's going to be the agency gets the report and they talk to the officer. You could suggest another qualified mental health professional. You know, this one's in there specifically because you could imagine someone who's very angry or traumatized, yelling at the person, threatening the person, right? And so there are things in place to protect the evaluator. You need to document everything you do. This is like good recommendation in general for folks who are doing evaluations really in general, but particularly in a legal setting. You want to document everything you're doing and why. You want to safeguard confidentiality of the written report. You're not sharing that all over. You're not publishing it in the local paper, right? And then you need to be aware of legal requirements in your jurisdiction and make sure that if the law is changing, you know, right? And so a lot of your job, as you can imagine, if you're working in this type of legal setting, is keeping up with law changes, keeping up with the literature to make sure you are always above board. And again, this is going to be the case for psychologists across the spectrum in terms of who we're treating and things along those lines. All right, so the next thing we're going to talk about is training, and I feel like that'll be better to like do all at once. So let's go ahead and end a few minutes early today. And then on Thursday, we'll talk about training, and we will watch an episode of a show depicting some of the things we're talking about.